Hi, friends. So today we are going to read a new book. We are going to learn about Titanic. Now, this is an historical nonfiction book, and we learn about history through books. That way, we learn about the past because, for example, this happened in 1912. Let me double check to be sure. Yes, it happened in 1912. And the reason why we learn about things in the past is that way we don't make the same mistakes. So, for example, in this book, we learned that there weren't enough lifeboats on the Titanic. So, what we do now is that we learn from that mistake, unfortunately, and then we now have, and we always make sure to put enough lifeboats on boats and big ships like these. So we're gonna go ahead and read. While I'm reading, I want you guys to maybe just call out some text features you see, anything interesting facts, you can write them down because Titanic has a lot of interesting facts. So let's start. Titanic, this is National Geographic for kids. Here we have our table of contents. Shipwrecks and sunken treasures. Ever dreamed of exploring the ocean for a shipwreck? Imagine how exciting it would be to discover a hidden treasure. Think that kind of thing only happens in the movies? Think again. In 1985, Robert Ballard led a team that discovered a sunken ship called RMS Titanic. Other people have found shipwrecks, but Titanic is special. It's one of the most famous ships of all time. The whole world was excited about Ballard's discovery. Here is Titanic's bow. Robert Ballard and his crew celebrate on board their research ship, the Nore, after the first spotted wreckage from Titanic in 1985. That is a picture of them. In his own words, my team has been watching the ocean floor with an underwater camera for days, and all we've seen was mud. Late one evening, our camera suddenly passed over a ship's boiler, and at that moment we knew we'd found it. The Wonder Ship. What made Titanic so special? In 1912, it was the biggest ship ever built. That's why some people called it the Wonder Ship. Other people called it a floating palace. Titanic had every possible luxury: fine wood, paneling, crystal, and gold light fixtures, and a grand staircase with a skylight above it. First-class passengers ate fancy meals and enjoyed the ship's gym and swimming pool. Titanic terms down here: luxury. Luxury is something that offers pleasure or comfort but isn't necessary, often difficult or expensive to get. There's the skylight view and everything, and the grand staircase. Here we have the first-class bedroom, gym, and the dining cafe. Titanic had 9 decks, or levels, with separate areas for first class, second class, and third class passengers. In her own words, my pretty little cabin with its electric heater and pink curtain delighted me. Its beautiful lace quilt and pink cushions and photographs all around it all looked so homey, which is a quote by a first class passenger, Lady Duff Gordon. Titanic terms on the side. We have bow, the front end of a ship, the stern, the back end of a ship, the hull, the lowest part of the ship, partly covered with water. And here, what do we call this? I'll see if someone is able to tell me in class the next day. 10 cool things about Titanic. Titanic was almost as long as 3 football fields. Including the 4 smokestacks, the ship was as tall as 17-story building. Fact number 3. Titanic's engines used more than 800 tons of coal each day. The ship's top speed was 24 knots, which is 27 miles an hour. Fact number 4. Titanic was one of the first ships to have a telephone system and electric lights in all the rooms. Number 5. The ship had 4 elevators, a heated swimming pool, a gym, 2 libraries, and 2 barbershops. Number 6. Each day, the passengers and crew used 14,000 gallons of drinking water. Number 7, smoke and steam made by Titanic's boilers escaped through 3 stacks. Builders added a 4th stack because it made the ship look better. Number 8, Titanic could carry 3,547 passengers and crew. About 2,200 people traveled on its first voyage. Number 9, some passengers paid about $99,000 in today's money to travel aboard Titanic. Number 10, to feed the passengers and crew, Titanic had 86,000 pounds of meat, 40,000 eggs, 40 tons of potatoes, 7,000 heads of lettuce, 3,500 pounds of onions, 36,000 apples, and 1,000 loaves of bread on board. That's a lot. Building Titanic. Titanic's tragic story began in 1907. That's when J. Bruce Ismay of the British shipping company White Star Line and William J. Peary of Harland and Wolff shipyards decided to build 3 huge ships. One of those ships was Titanic. In 1909, Thomas Andrews began work on Titanic in Belfast, Ireland. The ship was finished on March 31st, 1912. In early April, Titanic arrived in Southampton, England. Then, a 900-person crew took a week to prepare for the ship's first voyage. And here are each of the people. Bon voyage. When Titanic left England on April 10th, 1912, it had an impressive list of passengers. White Star Line's chairman, J. Bruce Ismay, and Titanic builder Thomas Andrews were on board. So were some of the richest people in the world. The ship also carried many middle-class passengers, and poor immigrants hoped for a better life in America. Titanic terms immigrants, people who leave one country to settle in another country. And this is an illustration of Titanic docked at Southampton, England. For the first few days of the trip, passengers felt like they were on vacation. They spent the time strolling around the deck, playing cards, and enjoying the ship's fine wood and other luxuries. But all that changed on Sunday, April 14th, 1912. That's when Titanic entered an area of the North Atlantic Ocean known as Iceberg Valley. This is passengers strolling through the deck of Titanic. And an iceberg is a large mass of ice floating in the sea. Weird, but true. Most of an iceberg's bulk is located below the ocean surface. That makes it hard for sailors to know how big the icy chunk really is. So here you cover it up because we can't see under the sea. It looks like a small iceberg, doesn't it? But then you look under and it's so much bigger. Tragedy at sea. As Titanic cruised across the wavy water at top speed, it received 9 ice warnings from other ships. But wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were busy sending and receiving messages from passengers. They didn't deliver all the warnings to the bridge. Titanic terms bridge, a ship's control center. Titanic was steered and navigated from its bridge. Wireless, an early form of radio that relayed messages through a coded series of beeps. This is the wireless room, similar to the one on Titanic. There's a man then doing all the wireless. Captain Edward J. Smith seemed to ignore the messages he did receive during the day. Before dinner, he finally changed the ship's course to the south, but he didn't slow down. Captain Smith had a long, successful career at sea. Commanding Titanic was supposed to be his last assignment before retiring, but he went down with his ship. After sunset, stars shone brightly in the moonless sky. The air was bitterly cold and the water was glassy smooth. Just before midnight, Frederick Fleet, one of the ship's lookouts, spotted a large dark object in the water. Weird but true, many people believed Titanic was unsinkable, but the builders never made that claim. He rang the alarm bell 3 times and shouted, "Iceberg right ahead!" First Officer William Murdoch reacted quickly. He offered the crew to reverse the engines and turn the boat left, away from the iceberg. Then he pulled a switch to close the bulkheads, but it was too late. Bulkheads are walls meant to slow or prevent flooding by separating Titanic's hull into 16 separate compartments. Most of the passengers were asleep. They didn't even feel the iceberg scrape the side of the ship, but the damage was done. Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews rushed below decks. When Andrews saw how much seawater was gushing into the ship, he estimated Titanic would sink in less than 2 hours. Doomed. Within 10 minutes of the collision, Titanic's 5 front compartments were flooded to a depth of 14 feet. Titanic's hull had 16 compartments. The ship could float if only the front 4 compartments flooded, but with 5 damaged compartments, Titanic was doomed. If Titanic had hit the iceberg straight on, it might not have sunk, and even if it had sunk, there would have been time for other ships to rescue the people on board. This is an illustration showing how Titanic's compartment flooded and how the water is gushing in. Captain Smith knew that Titanic had enough lifeboats for 1,178 people, only about half the number of passengers and crew on board. Many people would die if a rescue ship didn't arrive in time. He rushed to the ship's wireless room and ordered Phillips and Bride to send out distress calls. The first ship to respond was the Carpathia, but it was 58 miles away. It would need 4 hours to reach the sinking ship. Titanic's crew fired rockets to get the attention of a ship they could see about 10 miles away, but it never answered. The original plans for Titanic included 64 lifeboats, but the builders put in only 20, so first-class passengers would have more room to stroll around on the deck. The final hours. Trapped. First-class passengers had the best chance of getting seats in lifeboats. Because their rooms were on the upper decks, they could get to the lifeboats more quickly and easily. Many third-class passengers were trapped below decks. The lifeboats were ready by 12:25 a.m., but many people didn't want to board them. Climbing into the boats was scary. Many passengers couldn't believe that the wonder ship would soon be gone. The crew worried that they wouldn't have time to lower all the lifeboats, so some boats went down less than half full. Here we have a timeline, which is one of our text features. When the last lifeboat launched, more than 1,500 people were stranded on the sinking ship. As Titanic's stern tilted upward, hundreds of victims fell into the icy water. Others held on until the ship slid below the waves. People in the lifeboats were haunted by the victims' desperate screams for help. Then the sound slowly faded. And more of the timeline. They survived. Many people in the lifeboats were wearing their pajamas. After spending hours in the freezing cold, the Carpathia was a welcome sight. Carpathia's crew had plenty of clothes, blankets, and warm food ready for the survivors. They quickly helped the freezing people out of the little lifeboats. By 9 a.m. on Monday, April 15th, Carpathia was headed for New York with 705 survivors. Never again. After the Titanic tragedy, all ships had to have enough lifeboats for everyone on board. A new international ice patrol began tracking icebergs and warning nearby ships. One of Titanic's most famous survivors was first-class passenger Margaret Brown. She earned the name Unsinkable Molly Brown for helping people aboard lifeboats and insisting that her lifeboat try to rescue people in the water. She may have also taken a turn rowing her lifeboat toward Carpathia. A careful observer. First-class passenger Jack Thayer was 17 years old, too old to be allowed on a lifeboat. He jumped out into the water as Titanic sank and scrambled onto an overturned lifeboat. In 1940, Thayer wrote a vivid description of his Titanic experience. Robert Ballard used some of Thayer's details to find the sunken ship. Remember, Robert Ballard is the person who found the ship in 1985. A hard worker. Wireless operator Harold Bride stayed at his post until the last second. After jumping off the sinking ship, he managed to climb onto the same overturned lifeboat as Jack Thayer. Even though his feet were badly frostbitten, he later helped Carpathia's wireless operator send out survivor lists and personal messages. The final survivor. Third-class passenger Melvina Dean was the youngest person aboard Titanic. The tiny 3-month-old, her 2-year-old brother, and her mom were loaded into a lifeboat, but her father went down with the ship. Melvina was the last remaining Titanic survivor. She died in 2009. So who died? First class, 329 were in first class. Number who survived was 199, and people who died was 130, which that was 40%. And it goes into more detail. News of the disaster spread quickly. No one could believe it. The ship people said was unsinkable had vanished below the waves, and more than 1,500 passengers and crew had suffered a terrible death. The Titanic's tragic ending made the wonder ship even more famous. Over the years, dozens of books, films, songs, and musicals have retold the shocking story. Even though the ship is long gone, our fascination with it lives on. And this is an image of the film that they did of Titanic. In 1997, Titanic is the most successful movie of all time. In 2 years, it earned nearly $2 billion and won 11 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director. 10 real reasons for the Titanic tragedy. A hulking iceberg in the middle of the North Atlantic always gets blamed for sinking Titanic, but it's not the only reason for so many people lost their lives that night. Reason number 1. Titanic's builders removed some of the ship's lifeboats, like we've already learned. 2. The builders loaded Titanic's bulkheads to make more room for the grand staircase and other fancy features. If the bulkheads had been higher, the ship would have sunk more slowly. 3. Titanic's bow was stronger than the sides of the hull. If the ship had hit the iceberg head on, it might have not sunk. When Titanic scraped against the iceberg, the nail-like rivets used to attach the ship's metal sides to the frame broke. As the hull split open, seawater poured into the ship. 5. Titanic's original launch date was March 20th, 1912. If the ship had left then, the iceberg probably wouldn't have been in its path. 6. The sea was unusually calm on April 14th, 1912. Waves would have made the iceberg easier to spot. Titanic's crew couldn't find the ship's binoculars, so lookout Frederick Fleet was searching for icebergs with just his eyes. Search and discovery. For more than 70 years, no human eye saw Titanic. Many people tried to find the ship, but they failed. All that changed in 1985. That's when Robert Ballard used Argo, a new kind of underwater vehicle, to locate the trail of broken pieces that fell out of the Titanic as it sank. Then he followed this trail of remains to the ship. In 1986, Ballard visited the sunken ship in a tiny submarine. It landed on Titanic's deck and sent a robot named JJ inside to take a look around. Titanic treasures. When Robert Ballard announced Titanic's location in 1986, people began to visit the site. They all wanted to see the wonder ship, and many wanted to take pictures of it. People have removed more than 6,000 items from Titanic. Human bodies and clothing decay quickly in seawater, but shoes don't. A shoe marks a Titanic victim's final resting place. You can see the picture of the shoe underwater. Over time, visitors had damaged Titanic, so have tiny ocean creatures. Reddish-brown rusticles now cover most of the ship. They form as bacteria and fungi dine on iron and steel. In 2010, scientists spent 20 days photographing and filming every inch of Titanic, including its huge trail of broken pieces. The images will be used to create a 3D model of the site. You'll probably never visit Titanic in person, but soon you'll be able to explore the shipwreck virtually from the comfort of your living room. How cool is that? And we have our glossary. And the end.